Good evening, brothers and sisters. Very happy to see such a good turnout again. So tonight we're doing the second review, and last week we covered mind and body in general. But now we're going to go specific into mind, but we'll only take a look at the two aspects of mind which involves thinking and feeling, and that is cognition and affection. Quick run through of last week so that for the benefit of those who were not here, they can catch up, and for the rest of you, a little bit of a refresher. Bhante always says we are organisms in an environment because all there is this body that's going on, and this body is kept alive with the process of metabolism, as well as the fact that there are 5 physical senses in a human body, and they enable us to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch so that we're able to experience the environment. There is no self to contend with. There is no soul or spirit, so to speak, to contend with. All there is this activity of the body. And one of the important part of the body is the brain, where sense organs pick up signals and transmit to the brain, and the brain will process it. And it is this processing of these sense signals that lead to the awareness of the environment. So this consciousness we're talking about, or the awareness of our environment, basically involves the whole body. Of course, we can say most of it is happening in the brain, but there's still a lot of activity going on in the body that involves or that contributes to the awareness of the environment. The brain evolved, we spoke about the brain having evolved over millions and millions of years, billions actually. Organisms started appearing, life started appearing on planet Earth about 4 billion years back, right? And basically, the brain evolved over hundreds of millions of years into 3 main parts. The most primitive is the brainstem, followed by the emotional brain, the limbic system, followed by the thinking brain, which is the cerebral cortex. So there has been quite a lot of statements mentioned that the chitta is the original mind. So chitta actually refers to the emotional part of the mind. Mano refers to the thinking part of the mind. So if we want to look at the brain correlating with the mind, then we would say the activity of the limbic system basically contributes to this thing called the chitta. But it's not entirely that, because the chitta also involves parts of the body. And likewise, the activity of the cerebral cortex contribute to this aspect of the mind called mano, which is the thinking mind. So in ancient times, ancient organisms only had a very basic, simple brain stem, and then gradually evolved emotional brain, and then finally evolved with cerebral cortex in mammals. And as the mammals start to evolve further into human beings, then of course we have a more advanced cerebral cortex compared to other animals. Just a quick look at this progression. 400 million years ago, the only life form was in the ocean. So we could say fish was the only thing that had evolved at the time. There were no land animals. And then they discovered that around 360 million years ago, they started to find 4-legged land animals. So there was a puzzle. 400 million years ago, there were no 4-legged land animals. 360 million years ago, there were quite a bit of 4-legged land animals. So there must be a missing link in between. And a lot of scientists, of course, came up with a theory based on various fossils that they have uncovered, that it was fish that crawl onto land. And we learned last lesson that it is the name of the fish is Tiktaalik, or nicknamed Tiktaalik, crawl onto land, evolved into amphibians, And from amphibians, they evolved into reptiles. And these reptiles, some of the reptile species, began to climb up the trees. And when they got up to the trees, some of these reptile species evolved into birds. And I want to make a correction. Last week I drew incorrectly the arrow showing from bird to mammal, but actually it is not. Bird did not evolve into mammals. It was reptiles that evolved into mammals. So some of the early mammals that appeared on trees were like sloth. You know the sloth. It's a very slow-moving creature. And from there it evolved to various kind of tree-clinging mammals that descended down to the ground and became ground-dwelling mammals. And somewhere along the line, the ground-dwelling mammals, some of them somehow stood up and evolved into two-legged, standing bipedal mammals that eventually evolved into humans, Homo sapiens. In this process, when fish first came to land, the brain was a very, very primitive, only had a very basic, simple brain stem. And then the amphibians also did not have a very advanced limbic system, which is the emotional brain. It was reptiles that evolved a very advanced limbic system. If you think about it, if you see a frog coming from the garden into your kitchen, for example, and you try to chase it away, it won't run away. I mean, you can try to pretend to kick at it, it won't jump away. And you can easily kick at a frog, But if it was a lizard or a snake, it becomes very fearful. Lizard, for instance, the moment you bang on the table, you see the lizard turn around and run away because their limbic system was very advanced already. So they easily experience fear. In the same way, snake, but because snake had its a lot of ability to fight back, so snake always fight back. Never corner a snake because it will fight back. And then when it got to the birds, then the cerebral cortex started. So some birds actually can solve problems. Cerebral cortex helps the animal to solve problems. And mammals, of course, has a very simple form of cerebral cortex. And as it became more advanced, some of the more advanced species, like primates, started to have a more advanced cerebral cortex until the human, which has the most advanced. Now, some of you may wonder, in the oceans, you have those fish like sharks and all that. And then somebody says, what about whales and dolphins? Are whales and dolphins fish? Mammals. Why? What happened is that land animals, four-legged land animals, some of them found their way back into the ocean, went back to their roots. And they became dolphins and whales. Right? Not shark. Shark is still a fish. And this is really what happened. The brain evolved. And in the limbic system, there is a structure called the amygdala, which is responsible for all our suffering, basically. The amygdala is there to protect us from harm by sensing dangers and then reacting by releasing hormones for us to react. So the amygdala really has two paradoxical roles. The first one is our bodyguard. It helps to protect us from harm by sensing danger, but at the same time, the amygdala can be easily unnecessarily aroused. And when it is unnecessarily aroused, it actually starts to create unnecessary suffering, pain, and all kinds of emotional problems. One of the important things about the amygdala is that it is attached to a part of the brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the librarian of our memory. It doesn't store the memory, but it knows where memory is stored and it's able to gather memory. So when the amygdala is aroused, the way the amygdala gets aroused is hippocampus. When it senses something from the environment, the hippocampus will draw from memory and determine whether that thing that has been sensed is threatening or not. So there are a few things that seem threatening, and make us react as though it is harmful to us. Loud sound, very bright light, high temperature or extreme low temperatures, touching something which is painful, spiky or whatever, or tasting something that is very spicy or something that hurts the tongue, right? And smelling very strong odors. And these are sensations that are unpleasant. So sensing these sensations is the process of sanya. I won't talk about sanya and vedana yet because I will leave it to the next session, because that is better discussed in conjunction with the Panchakanda, the 5 aggregates. Because you cannot understand sanya, vedana and the relationship with the rest of the mind without looking into the 5 aggregates. And that will be the next session. For this session, we look at the higher level of the mental function, cognition and affection. So the amygdala can be unnecessarily aroused even by the slightest thing. You can be sitting there and then somebody drops a glass and clang, and that noise can actually arouse your amygdala, cause your body to react. So that aspect is that it is like a terrorist in the brain. So the amygdala behaves like a terrorist in the brain as well as the bodyguard to protect us from harm. But what can help us overcome these things is the ability to think as human beings. We have evolved a very superior cerebral cortex or learning brain compared to other species. And it is made of 4 lobes. It is the frontal lobe that is responsible for most of the thinking functions listed there. But the most critical ones that are responsible for our happiness are found in that little part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, directly behind the eyebrow. And that is responsible for decision making, goal setting, planning, judgment, reasoning, and rationalizing. And that can help us overcome various emotional problems if we train our mind to make use of it. So making use of our thinking, our rational thinking, that can help us reduce the harmful effect of emotional arousals. So let's take a quick look at the brain again. I'll show this for the benefit of those who who were not here last week.
The brain controls every aspect of our lives. As humans have evolved, it's doubled in size. It weighs only 3 pounds, but it consumes 20% of all the fuel our bodies take in, generating enough energy to keep a light bulb burning.
And you have to consider the brain having evolved like an old house, where we just added different rooms. And so there's all these stairways and connections.
In the basement is the oldest part, called the brain stem. It's something we share with reptiles and other mammals. It's what keeps us alive, governing vital functions like heart rate, respiration, digestion, and blood pressure. Things that happen without having to think about them.
The next level up, the first floor, more evolved. Hundreds of thousands of years later, it's called the limbic system. And this is very important in the processing of emotions.
Within the limbic system are the amygdala, 2 nuggets of tissue, 1 in each half of the brain. They are no bigger than a fingernail, yet they are the brain's central command center for our emotional reactions. One of the simplest and strongest of these is fear, a primal emotion we all share.
If you had to pick one brain region that was most important in fear, it would be the amygdala.
What scientists discovered is that as humans evolved, another part of the brain, called the cortex, also became involved in processing fear.
The part that makes us most human about the brain is our frontal cortex.
If the amygdala is the first floor, the cortex is the second floor of the brain. It's the brain's thin, wrinkly outer layer that's divided into 4 sets of lobes.
If you unfolded the cortex of a monkey, it would be about the size of a piece of paper. If you unfolded our cortex, it's about 4 sheets of paper. large. And the reason it's wrinkly is because you have to squish that all inside of the skull.
The frontal lobes comprise the area just above our eyes, and these are the newest rooms of the brain. As humans evolved, the frontal lobes became the place where conscious, rational thought is processed. It's where we do our problem solving.
The frontal lobes are so interesting because they are really the conductor of the brain. They synchronize all activity.
Scientists made a major breakthrough in fear research when they found that information from our senses reaches the amygdala almost twice as fast as it takes to get to our frontal lobes. The speed of the different brain signals means unless we instinctively know how to react to a potential threat, we may freeze in fear, waiting for the frontal lobes to catch up to figure out the right response.
Part of what happens with fear and panic is the unknown, is not knowing what to do next, and so your brain essentially freezes the way a deer freezes in the headlight.
So the amygdala may get very fast signals about fear, but sometimes they're wrong, and quickly the situation may say to you, no, it's not a fear situation, and you're not afraid. So these very quick amygdala signals that you get can be controlled in sort of a top-down way.
She said that the amygdala signals that cause all this fear can be controlled in a top-down way. What she meant by top-down way is the use of our thinking brain. By utilizing the thinking brain, it is able to tame the amygdala. But we need to train the thinking brain because by default, the thinking brain does not have that ability to easily tame the amygdala. We'll talk a little bit more about how we can do that in the future, because today we will just focus on the two processes, right? The Buddha has always described the mind using three words, and Bhante has translated it very well and differentiated them. That vijnana is referring to the process of perception, where we become aware of objects out there through our sense organs. So you could say the vijnana is the process of awareness of objects. But it doesn't know what it is. It's just being aware there is something. I saw something, I heard something, but it doesn't know what it is, because knowing what it is the work of the mano. Mano will interpret it. Mano is the process of cognition and conception. Cognition is basically interpreting what it is, and conception is then creating a story behind it. So what happens is when we see, hear, smell, taste or touch, a mental image arises, and that is the vijnana. The arising of this mental image is the result of the five aggregates, the panchakanda, giving rise to the vijnana. And with this mental image, rupa, arising in the mind, mano will then interpret it and give it a meaning. And the meaning given is nama, giving it a label or name to call it something. So seeing this thing, then we call it a book. And that book, the word book, is a name given, and that gives meaning to what it is. This process is papancha, the process of interpretation. And then, at the same time, depending on the interpretation, the chitta will react. Because if the interpretation leads to dissatisfactoriness, then the chitta will react. And this reaction is an emotional reaction. By the way, you can download all this at the end of today, and I have revised the explanation of what is chitta and made it simpler. Because when I thought about it, I said the explanation of chitta was not adequate. If I were to revise it comprehensively, it'll be too long. It'll take half a page. So I decided to simplify it and simply say chitta leads to this emotional reaction, tanha, and this is because of the emotional excitement, and as a result of all this, it gives rise to the mood and the temperament. Mood is how we feel about that situation. This feeling is nothing to do with Vedana. This is the feeling of whether it is something we enjoy or we don't enjoy. For example, loud sounds. For people like us, loud music is not enjoyable. Most of us, we don't like loud music. On the other hand, young kids, they like this music band that is playing very loud. So loud music is enjoyable to them. So that is the reaction, and that is the mood. They will feel good about listening to loud music. We will feel bad, and that is the mood. And the temperament is basically the way we behave as a result of that. So it is that, and the way we behave is the emotional reaction. And then at the same time, every experience we encounter, the mind automatically, by default, it clings on to it and personalize it and say, I feel this, I see that. You know that every morning you wake up, and if you happen to knock your hand against the wall when you get out of bed, or knock your head and it feels the pain, and the thought arises, oh, I feel pain, or my head hurts. Or you wake up with a running nose and headache, oh, I am getting sick today. What's the first word that comes to your mind? It's the I. Every experience we encounter, automatically the mind personalizes it by putting the I in front. In a shopping mall, you see your friend coming from a distance. Ah, I see my friend coming. What's the first word? I. Think about it. Every time you experience something, when the thought arises, the first word is always I, me, or mine. So that is the result of this clinging, the upadana, personalization, which is translated as clinging, grasping, or attachment. But Bhante translated as personalization. We personalize it. So we'll look a little bit into this later on when we talk about how the self arises, because this is the part that produces the delusion of a self-centered existence. So these are the three activities of the mind. They can only be experienced. Right? Activity can only be experienced. It is not an entity. It does not exist. This is why Bhante always says, there is no mind. And of course, a lot of people object to that. Why? Because almost every other person I come across that tries to teach this stuff, every person I come across that tries to teach this stuff will always look at it from an existential perspective. They always think the mind exists. But Bhante has taught us that life is experiential. Nothing exists. Right? So it's the experiential. Mind is something that is experiential. So the three mental experiences, first is perception, right? The ability to perceive. The second one is mano, which is cognition and conception. Right? Cognition and conception, the ability to cognize, right? Be aware of what the object is, and then conceive, be able to produce a story behind it. And it is this conception, this concept, that arouses the chitta. And this is the part of Bhante's research which a lot of other translators are not aware of, because they don't think of it in a scientific way and they don't connect it like that. Every translator that sees the word mano calls it mind. Every time they see the word chitta, they call it mind. Now, if everything is mind, it becomes very confusing. Bhante was so brilliant. He was able to differentiate what is emotional mind, chitta, and what is the thinking mind, the mano. So this is that part. And then the chitta is the emotion, the urges. Right? Emotion come from the word emote, the urge to do something. So you want to react. And affection is the feeling of it, whether you like it or not like it. So affection leads to mood, emotion leads to temperament. One is how you feel about it, the other one is what are you going to do about it. And that is the reaction, the emotional reaction. Okay. So today we will take a look at mano and chitta. Next session on September 3, we'll talk about vijnana together with the Panchakanda, the 5 aggregates. And that is a very important session, because the 5 aggregate will provide you with the foundation to understanding Bhante's teaching on Paticca Samuppada. So, this was shown last week. Just very quickly, summarizing, the Bhante pointed out that vijnana is the reaction of the senses to stimulations from the environment. So it's really the activity of the body both the body, meaning the whole body, the sense organs, the nerves, the spinal cord, and the brain, right? And Vijnana has been translated as consciousness. I explained that consciousness has many different levels. It is the lowest level of consciousness. Then it is correct. But if you talk about consciousness in general, then Vijnana is not consciousness. It is perception, being aware of object. That's it. You have now seen an object, heard a sound, touched something, smelled something, and that's it. But you don't know what it is. So Vijnana is really, it arises with the 5 aggregates, the Panchakanda, but Bhante calls it the 5 constituents of the process of perception. That is Bhante's term for Panchakanda, and that's very, very precisely correct. The 5 constituents of the process of perception. So when we go into the Panchakanda, you will then realize what I mean when I said Bhante's translation is very, very accurate here. Whereas everybody else talk about 5 aggregate, and then what does 5 aggregate mean? It's a term that is a very blur, right? It's very blur. It's like the word mindfulness. It's also a very blur term. So with these 5 physical senses, it brings in information to the brain, and then we become aware of the environment, right? So light enters the eye, we have what is called Rupa Vijnana, right? Or Chaku Vijnana, sorry. The light enters the eye, we have Chaku Vijnana, being aware, and it produces the Vijnana of Rupa. That means mental image. Again, I'd like to remind you that the word Rupa is often translated as object, matter, materiality, corporeality. That's one crazy word, right? Corporeality. Why do they want to find a word like that? All these words are wrong. And I can prove it scientifically at the next session. I'll show you why. Rupa is the mental image. And for those of you who are aware of Bahasa or even Sinhalese, the word Rupa simply means appearance of an image. That's it. So you will notice that some of these words that are derived from Sanskrit, we have the same words in Bahasa Malaysia. Taste. What is taste? Rasa. Now you get what I mean when I say some of these words, Bahasa Malaysia are derived, some of the Bahasa Malaysia words are derived from Sanskrit. So this is what it is. You have Chaku Vijnana, that is when you become aware of light entering the eye, you're aware of seeing something. You're aware of smelling something is Ganya Vijnana. You're aware of touching something is Kaya Vijnana. You're aware of hearing something is Sota Vijnana. And then you become aware. And then all this is put together by the process in the mind called Mano. So Vijnana is arising in the mind, whatever that has stimulated your sense organs, now Mano is putting it together, compiling it together, and not only do that, compiling it together, putting it together is cognizing. Then it's trying to interpret and give meaning, and that is conception. So the Vijnana does 2 things, right? Cognizing, putting it all together, and then producing a conception. And conception results in the word Dharma. Actually, I should spell that in small d. Dharma here does not mean the truth. Actually, the word Dharma never meant the truth. The word Dharma really means experience. But people like to use the word Buddha Dharma, that is the truth of the Buddha. No, the Buddha never taught the truth. The Buddha taught his reality, his experiential reality, what the Buddha experienced. The Buddha experienced sensual pleasures as a prince Siddhartha, then became ascetic and learned how to meditate deeply until he experienced Nibbana. Then he was teaching people how to accomplish that through the Eightfold Way. So the Buddha was really teaching his experience. So Dharma is really, the meaning of the word Dharma is experience, the closest word. See, Pali is very unusual. I'm not a Pali expert, but I have learned at least this aspect of it from Bhante. Pali is a very unusual language. There are very few English words that can match any Pali word. So the word Dharma means quite a few things. Experience is probably the closest to it. So you begin to experience the environment. This is what it is. You are experiencing the environment with the help of the mano. So the mano actually, what it does is each sense organ produces different perceptions. And the mano puts it together. That is cognition. And then the mano tries to compare these sense perception, which arises, like for example, in the case of seeing, arises in the form of rupa. Now we use seeing because seeing is the most complex of all the 5 senses. So we use rupa as an example because it's the most complex of the 5 senses. So it arises, and then the mano begins to compare it with categorized memory of past experience, and this comparison is papancha. And it gives meaning, and this meaning is really to identify it. It's an identity. So there's a label given to it to identify it. Seeing this, you call this a computer mouse. You have just identified this as a computer mouse. That is the nama, a mouse. That's the nama you've given to it. So that's what happens. And this produces the concept of what you have just experienced. Afterwards, I will go a little bit deeper into papancha, and then you can get what I mean. And then at the same time, the mano has its own awareness of past experiences. So it actually is able to look at the past experiences as well. So these sense organs bringing in sensations into the mind, and then we become aware of what we have seen, heard, smell, taste, and touch is the perception. This is what was perceived by the sense organ, and then mano is conception, putting it all together, giving it meaning. So what was recognized, and then we begin to give it meaning. Right? So if we look at the flow chart, stimulations from activities in the environment begin to stimulate the 5 senses, and that gives rise to the process of panchakanda, and then we become aware that we have seen something. We are able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. This is vijnana. We have the perception of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, each individually, and then the mano puts it together. When light enters the eye, we become aware of something that is seen out there, and this mental image that arises is the rupa. And with that, the mano interprets it by comparing it to categorized memory of past experience. Why categorized? Because everything we remember is in category form. When you see this and you call this a computer mouse, even if you've seen this for the first time, it's because you have seen hundreds of computer mouse before. And all the different shapes and sizes of computer mouse come together in your mind to form a category called computer mouse. So the moment you see something that resembles it, then you can call it a mouse because you recognize it because of the categorized memory of past experiences. And this is recognition, the process of recognition. And with recognition, you begin to form an experience by giving it a name. Giving it a name is the conception. Right? So, concept of an entity identified as a dog. Right? So, this is really what papancha is about. Mano compares sense perception, rupa, with categorized memory of past experiences, and this comparison process is papancha, and then begin to give meaning to it or identifying it. So in the form of a name or a label, and this is nama. The name or label given is nama to what was perceived. And this identification process is recognition. It is also a kind of interpretation. It is also conception of what was perceived, and this represents our experience, dharma, of seeing the object. We have experienced seeing something and knowing what it is. That is the experience.
Take a look at this object. One glance and you know what it is. But how do you know what it is and where it's positioned in space? Well, let's break it down. The light reflected by this object is converted by your eyes into an electrical signal and is sent down a neurological pathway called the optic nerve to the back of your brain. Starting in this region, called the visual cortex, The image is cross-referenced with memory of past experiences stored throughout your brain as you try to identify the object. Once it's figured out what it is, your brain has to decide how the object is positioned in space.
And this is a scientific explanation, and this is exactly the way Bhante has explained it. Unfortunately, many people explain the word papancha as mental proliferation. It is translated as mental proliferation. That is incorrect. I will show you later on what is mental proliferation. Mental proliferation is something later on, deeper, when you begin to create all kinds of stories with imagination and memory and expectations to produce a big charita, a big story of what you have just experienced. But papancha is purely interpretation. So Mano compares it with categorized memory and giving it meaning and an identity in the form of a name. The identification is these things. So if you want to have, what is the meaning of papancha? If you want to have one word to describe it, well, there's not one word that actually describes it. You can call it identification. You can call it recognition, which is recognition, where you recognize something. You can call it interpretation. You can call it conception. That's really what papancha is. What it is not is mental proliferation. Mental proliferation means the mind begins to run away and create all kinds of stories about the past, present, and future, and what it does to me, and how it affects me, and this is the mind going crazy. And people go insane when they encounter mental proliferation. It is mental proliferation that leads to people maybe having depression or having various kinds of mental illnesses. So, mind as an activity, we have basically very quickly covered Mano. I think I won't go much deeper than that. There are a few other things we can talk about Mano, maybe some later date. Now we're going to take a look at Chitta. Now I have simplified the explanation of what is Chitta. I call it simply emotional reaction. And that leads to mood and temperament. That's all. Because it's a little bit complex because if I were to explain it further, then I will have to take up half a page, and I don't want to do that. Keep it simple. Chitta is our emotional reaction to whatever we have experienced. That's it. And there is also another part which I'll talk about, the personalization part. I'll talk about some other time in the future. Today we'll focus more on this emotional reaction. In order to understand emotional reaction, we have to understand the meaning of the word tanha, because that's emotional reaction, tanha. And in order to understand tanha, we go back to the very root of the Buddha's teaching. In the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, where the Buddha spoke about the Four Noble Truths. Now I'm going to show you the common or popular translation, dukkha. Dukkha is translated as suffering. There is suffering. And then there is an origin to suffering. There is a reason behind why we suffer. And then suffering can be ended. There is an end to suffering. And then, of course, there is a way leading to the ending of suffering. Now, this is the popular translation. Bhante's translation of the Four Noble Truths, the Four Noble Truths is the Chattari Ariya Sachani. And this is he calls it the fourfold supernormal reality. Notice Bhante never likes to use the word truth. If you think about it, it's important. Truth. What is the word truth? Truth is an existential term. This is the truth. Therefore, you point to something and say, this is the truth. And that is a statement, is the truth. Now, when you say this is the truth, anything else which is not consistent with it is not the truth. If it is not the truth, then it's a lie. It's falsehood. That's why truth is black and white. But life is not black and white. Right? Life is experiential. So, these are not four noble truths. They are the fourfold supernormal reality. Dukkha. Bhante calls it insecurity. So basically, we're insecure. And that insecurity leads to all kinds of mental conditions. Suffering, unhappiness, dissatisfactoriness, stress, distress. Something happens to the body, something happens to the mind. And then, the origin of insecurity, because we're clinging on to the dream of existence. We always think that we exist. And because our mind is naturally, without training, our mind is naturally existential thinking. Every time we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, we try to figure it out in terms of existential terms. Right? And it is this that leads to a lot of delusion and misunderstanding. And what is then the third noble truth, the ending of suffering? It is really the ending of insecurity by awakening from this dream of existence. And finally, the way leading to this ending of insecurity is awakening, and this awakening is through the supernormal eightfold way, which is popularly translated as Noble Eightfold Path. Again, Noble Eightfold Path is an existential term. What's the key word? Path. What is a path? A road. That is existential. What is the way? The way does not exist. The way is the journey. So one is the journey, the other one is the road. So Bhante always likes to use words that reflect experiential. So it's very important for us to realize why Bhante choose these words. So reality is experiential. Way is experiential. The way. The way is not something that physically exists, but the path is the road. You can see the road, you can point to the road. You can start up your ways and you can get the way, you can get the path, right? But the way is that the experience of going through the journey. So the Eightfold Way is not something you learn about. It is something you practice. I mentioned in the last sharing, the doctrine of the Buddhists is the so-called the Four Noble Truths, or rather the Fourfold Supernormal Reality. That is the doctrine, to understand thoroughly. A deep and full comprehension of that will lead to vipassana. You're then at the doorstep of Nibbana already. And the practice of the Buddhists is the supernormal Eightfold Way. The Eightfold Way is the practice. So now let's take a look at these Four Noble Truths. And the first two are very important. Let's take a look at the first two first. The first Noble Truth, I'm going to use popular translation first so that it is not confusing to you. There is suffering, and the Buddha described 8 different conditions of suffering. The first 4 are very straightforward: birth, aging, sickness, and death. Then the next 3 are separation from what is pleasing. In other words, if you experience something pleasant and now you no longer have it, that is suffering. Union with what is displeasing. If you know something is hurting you and then you're stuck with it, that is suffering. Then you wish for things but you're not getting it, that is suffering. And finally, the last one, the 8th one, is actually the most critical one. In order to understand this, you need to understand the Panchakanda. But this is associated with the Panchakanda, the so-called the 5 aggregates. In brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging is suffering. That means when we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, we begin to personalize each experience. That process of personalizing that experience leads to suffering. Because together with the personalizing of the experience, we begin to personalize the body to be the self being affected by the experience. Our mind is thinking existential. So when we experience something, the first thing the mind wants to do is cling on to something. And then there is this body. Then we begin to cling on to this body and say, this body is me. I am feeling this. I am experiencing that. This is really the reason why this clinging of the body will lead to a lot of suffering. And we'll take a deeper look into this at the next sharing. But meanwhile, we go back to talk about the chitta part. So dukkha. Dukkha, there are many words to describe dukkha. Suffering, of course, is the most popular one. But dissatisfactoriness is dukkha. Unhappiness is dukkha. Stress is dukkha. Distress is dukkha. Stress is the physical suffering from your body changing and then you're feeling pain in the body. Distress is the mind being affected by it and the mind experiencing dissatisfactoriness or pain in the mind, mental suffering. So stress is physical suffering, distress is mental suffering. All these are dukkha. So how do they come about? Why do we suffer then? The second noble truth explains why. And it is because of tanha, commonly translated as craving. And this leads to renewed existence. And this reaction simply leads to renewed existence because this reaction makes us think in existential terms and clinging on to life. And when your mind begins to think that I exist and I'm living this dear life, then good luck, you will be reborn over and over again. So this clinging on to existence is the delusion of existence, dream of existence. This is what the Buddha, what Bhante pointed out. It is the dream of existence. So tanha is really emotional reaction, right? And it is unfortunately translated as craving, which is hard to understand. Emotional reaction is very straightforward, and this emotional reaction for sensual pleasures. When you experience something pleasant, now you want more of it. Emotional reaction towards something towards non-existence. When you experience something unpleasant, you don't want it to exist. You want to get rid of it. You want it to stop. And at the same time, you are clinging on to this body, and there is this emotional reaction to wanting to live longer. You see, it's very natural human desire to live longer, thinking that long life is a good life. So we want to continue to exist. We don't want to die tomorrow. Who wants to die tomorrow? Anybody? How about next week, next month, next year? Right? We want to live as long as possible. Have you set a target when you're going to die? No. We want to live as long as possible. That's what it is. Clinging on to continued existence. So this three kinds of tanha. The first one is when something pleasant arises and then we begin to want more of it. That wanting it is lust. Lust turns to greed. Right? Lust means I want it. Now, when you begin to get what you want, do you say, okay, that's enough? Now, if you are a businessman and your business in the first 2 years made you 1 million ringgit, are you going to say, oh, that's enough, I don't want to make more money? Will you do that? Oh, no. If you are a durian lover and you enter your next door neighbor's house and he happened to open a few durians, after taking 2 seeds, are you going to say to him, okay, thank you, I don't want any more? How many people will do that, you know? We want more. So lust turns to greed. Once we get what we want more. In the same way, tanha for non-existence is the reaction towards something unpleasant. You want it to stop. First, you want to avoid it, and that's called aversion. Now, if you try to avoid something that is unpleasant and you can't get rid of it and it keeps coming back to you, what happens? You get angry and you hate it. Aversion turns into hatred. This is dosa. So loba is the lust and greed. Dosa is the aversion and hatred. And finally, you are clinging on to the experience and connecting it with the body, and you have the delusion that, oh, I exist. And moha is really the delusion of a self-centered existence. It's not just delusion. And some people translate the word moha as ignorance. Well, ignorance leads to this, but the real meaning of moha is really better understood as delusion of a self-centered existence. It's a delusion that I exist, right? So these are the three kinds of tanha, three evil roots, akusala mula, the three things that lead to all kinds of suffering. So these three tanha is kama tanha, which is giving rise to loba, because it's something pleasant. The vibhava tanha means you want it not to exist, and that is giving rise to dosa, the aversion and hatred towards displeasures. And then finally, bhava tanha, thinking that I exist. So the tanha for continued existence, delusion of a self-centered existence. So now let's take a look at what Bhante says about these emotional reactions as a result of the activity of chitta.
So in the human being, the thinking part is called mano, whereas the emotional part is called chitta. But the Buddha pointed out was, what has to be done is not to obey the chitta. What is happening today is that the mano part, the thinking part, is doing what the chitta wants. You see, chitta is dominating the mind. And the mano is just catering to the chitta. There is a verse where the Buddha says, Chittena niyati loko, chittena parikassati, chittassa eka dhammassa, sabbeva vasamangvagu. What that means is, chitta is dominating the world. Chittena niyati loko. Loka is the world. Chittena niyati loko. Chittena parikassati. Chitta is disturbing everything. Chittassa eka dhammassa. Chitta is that one thing. Sabbeva vasamangvagu. That everyone is spellbound by chitta. Everyone is dominated by chitta. Like being spellbound. So therefore, the only thing is to learn how to gain control over the chitta, the emotional part.
And Bhante basically has spent his life teaching us how to gain control over the chitta through various practices, meditation, sutra class, and also personal advice, and the yoga. So all these things are what Bhante has been teaching us to gain control over chitta. Because the natural phenomenon of this chitta is to dominate us. And Bhante was quoting from this sutra, in the Chitta Sutra, in Samyutta Nikaya. Basically, emotions dominate the world. Emotions create distress. Emotion is that one thing to which all are spellbound. Again, this part is often translated by other popular translators as mind. And mind is confusing, but Buddha was referring to chitta, because you can see there, Buddha was referring to the emotion, because he was using the word chitta. So it's very important, and we owe Bhante a very big favor for having taught us to differentiate between mano and chitta. And that helped us understand tremendously what the Buddha was really trying to teach us. And this is really the original teachings of the Buddha, that this is talking about our emotions taking control of us. We've got to learn to do something about it, because chitta dominates. Mano is doing what the chitta wants. That's Bhante pointed out. And some of you may find it surprising, but that's what it is. When chitta arises, it takes control, and mano begins to be very obedient naturally. But in a trained mind, we can overcome that. But without proper training, the mano naturally will try to satisfy the chitta. And chitta is dominating the mind. Mano is just catering to the chitta, and we are all spellbound by chitta. The solution is to learn how to gain control over the chitta. And Bhante has been very wise. He took the original teachings of the Buddha and looked at modern psychology and philosophy and modern science, neuroscience, medicine, because he has a background in medicine, and he started to connect them and taught us. So here he begins to talk about modern psychology, and one of the often misunderstood psychologists is Sigmund Freud. There are many teachings of Sigmund Freud which are disputable or debatable, but there are some teachings which are very helpful. And Bhante was very wise in selecting the aspects of Sigmund Freud's teachings which make sense. Of course, he also highlighted certain aspects of Sigmund Freud's teaching which may not connect properly with the Dharma. So here is what Bhante is talking about it.
It is very important to understand that modern psychologists have become aware of this. It was Sigmund Freud. He didn't use words like chitta and mano, but he used words to refer to the emotional part and the thinking part. He began to understand these two things, chitta and mano. The emotional part he called the id, I-D, id. The thinking part he called the ego. The thinking part he thought of as something that is conscious and doing thinking, whereas the emotional part is unconscious. But he also saw that even the thinking part is mostly unconsciously done. That even our thinking is to a great extent unconscious. That is why he spoke of this unconscious. And to explain the unconscious, he used the analogy of an iceberg. Yeah. He used the iceberg. It's like we put a block of ice on the water or something. It floats. So the iceberg is a huge block of ice floating in the ocean. So what he pointed out was that when that block of ice is floating in the water, a greater part of the block of ice is under the water, and only a small part is seen at the top. So in the same way, our mind, the greater part of the mind is unconscious, and only a small part is conscious. Now his problem was how to gain control over these emotions. He saw that it is very important to gain control over the emotions, that we must somehow control the emotions. Because normally people are being dominated by the emotions. He was aware of this. But he thought we can never get rid of emotions. Because emotions are things that come from the body itself. It is the body that contains all the organs necessary for the emotion to arise. And therefore, we cannot get rid of the emotions. That is what he saw.
Sigmund Freud's problem is that he associated emotions with instincts, and he basically categorized instinct as something that is permanently in us. We can't get rid of it. And he described the model of the mind, or model of this mental self, the mind, the psyche, with it referring to the emotional part of the mind, the unorganized, unconscious mind driven by instincts, and this has been there since birth, and that was the way he saw it. That was his mistake. Basically, he came to the conclusion you can't get rid of it. And then the ego is the conscious and organized part of the mind which seeks to please its unconscious commands and mediates and rationalizes between this emotional part of the mind and the reality of what you're experiencing. To that extent, he was correct here, that our thinking mind is always trying to do something according to the emotional desires and the emotional urges. But he described a third aspect of the mind called the superego. Basically, this is the internalized system of rules and guidance, belief system, conscience. So if you want one word to describe what is superego, it's conscience, basically. Conscience and this self-centeredness, and to gratify whatever we feel, whatever we believe in. Right? So this is the conscious part of the mind. It corresponds with chitta. Ego corresponds with mano. What does superego correspond with from the Buddha Dharma? 2 words. Hiri and Ottappa. Hiri, well, I wouldn't say it is exactly one for one, but basically that's what it is. You could, in a nutshell, say Hiri and Ottappa is some kind of the work, the activity of a conscience, right? Being aware that something is not good or not wholesome, you want to avoid it, or you feel regret doing it. So, Hiri basically is the avoidance of something you know is unwholesome. Ottappa is doing something and realizing that it causes harm or causes problems, and you regret, not really regret, but you realize you shouldn't have done it. The awareness that you shouldn't have done it, or you shouldn't be doing it. So this is Hiri and Ottappa. And this is what Bhante said, basically. The thinking part is normally conscious, and the emotional part is normally unconscious. But unfortunately, in most people, even the thinking part is mostly unconscious. So what's the meaning of unconscious here? Unconscious means it arises without you wanting it. It arises without you willing it. Huh? No. It arises without you willing it. So in a nutshell, this basically points to the notion that we do not have free will. That even the conscious thoughts arise, or rather the thinking arises without our control. We experimented, I think we didn't try that. We'll do that afterwards. I think we didn't try the observing thoughts. I think that was in the other sharing. Okay. Thoughts will arise without us willing it. At the end, if we have time, we'll try that. I'm going to show you that thoughts arise, even conscious thoughts arise without you wanting it. So it's arising of thoughts without you willing it, and it is unconscious. It's only when it arises, then you become aware of it after it arises. And basically, Sigmund Freud uses the iceberg, the analogy of the iceberg, that the greater part is submerged, unconscious, and a small part is above the surface. That is the conscious part. So even our thinking mind, the greater part of it is unconscious, and only a small part of it is conscious. And emotions are things that come from the body. That's what Bhante pointed out, right? Basically, now this point itself, some people might challenge, because how can emotion come from the body? Until 150 years ago, scientists used to think that emotion is purely in the mind. But 150 years ago, a very famous psychologist, William James, pointed out that emotions begin with the body. So, and I'm going to show you in a moment that the unconscious part of the mind gives rise to activity in the body, and that leads to emotions. Because the body contains all the organs necessary for emotions to arise. That's exactly what Bhante said, and that is perfectly true. Because in our emotional brain, there is the amygdala, which can easily arouse, and when it is aroused, it triggers a release of hormones, and that causes a reaction in the body. So emotion come in two dimensions: physiological and psychological. Physiological means when emotions are aroused, quickly it releases hormones in the body, and then the body feels tensed. You see, when you are fearful, the first time you realize you are fearful, what have you realized? That moment, you realize that your teeth are clenched and your muscles are all tensed. You don't realize the arising of fear until your body has changed. Then only you realize, oh, this is disturbing me. Loud sound making you feel angry. By the time you realize that loud sound is making you feel angry, your body has changed. You know, when there's a loud sound, everybody shakes. You know, whole body shakes. The body reacts first. And it is this reaction that goes and disturbs the mind. And then the psychological part comes in. Then so this body part is stress. The psychological part is distress, mental suffering. Stress is the physical suffering, and distress is the mental suffering. So amygdala has these two paradoxical roles, and it begins to release hormone. And what happens is that when you see, hear, smell, taste, touch something that is unpleasant, the first thing that happens is the brain sends a signal to the adrenal gland, and the adrenal gland begin to release hormones, two powerful stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, and it starts to cause changes in the body. Heart beat faster, muscle gets tensed up, your blood pressure rises, your breathing deepens, and so on. And then it causes your hair to stand on end, and your temperature rising, and you cause facial expression to be distorted, right? And you may start to perspire, and you can see now here. We don't have long hair, so we can't see our hair standing on end, but this is an example here, that hair standing on end. Facial expression distorted. Facial expression distorted here, right? Muscles all tensed up, right? And we do experience hair standing on end, except we can't see it. We call it goosebumps, goose pimple. When you experience goosebumps or goose pimple, that is your hair standing on end. Think about it. When you watch a horror movie, suddenly something very fearful comes up. What happens? Your hair is standing on end. That's really what it is, right? And then other things will happen. So we have to be very careful, because all this is very unhealthy for us, right? And it increases your blood sugar, and that is necessary to convert stored energy into active energy. So the blood sugar is doing that. So in other words, if you are emotional a lot, very frequently, you easily become diabetic. You have to be aware. People who experience diabetes are experiencing perhaps some kind of an emotional problems in their life, right? So all these are various conditions in the body which disturb the mind, and that disturbance of the mind, it leads to psychological disturbances, and then emotion becomes psychological, become mental, right? So it begins in the body. And the way to overcome this is using methods that are taught in cognitive psychology. Because when it comes to stopping emotional arousal or calming emotional arousal, unfortunately, Sigmund Freud got it wrong. Because he said you have to analyze and find the root cause before you can solve the problem. But in today, all the best people who are able to help you overcome your emotional problems, they don't need to dig into the real nitty-gritty details to analyze. They can just help you overcome, and you can easily overcome. There are many various techniques that can help you do that. So let's listen to what Bhante has to say about this cognitive psychology.
And during the 1960s, a new kind of psychology came into being. And that is what is called cognitive psychology. And these cognitive psychologists, they began to realize that there was a method of gaining control over emotions. That is the important thing. And what was that method? They pointed out that they also saw this same problem. What is that? The mano and the chitta. Now what Sigmund Freud called the id and the ego. These people call the ego the cognitive part. And the emotional part they called the affective. The cognitive and the affective. And they pointed out that the emotions are excited only according to the way the cognitive part or the mano interprets circumstances. You see, I told you some time back, a few days ago, that we are born with 5 senses, and the 5 senses are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. But all that goes to the brain, and it is the brain that begins to think, and that is the mano part. And according to the way you think and interpret what is going on there, the emotion is aroused. So the emotion is based on the way you interpret your circumstances. And therefore, if you change the way you interpret your circumstance, the emotion is not aroused.
So what did Bhante say? Bhante mentioned the word about cognitive psychology, that there are methods for gaining control over our emotions. And basically this affective process, the emotion, it is aroused according to the way our thinking mind, the cognitive part, is interpreting our circumstances. So if we can change the way we interpret our circumstances, emotions will not be aroused. We can at least tame it by changing the way we interpret our circumstances. And this is actually where Sigmund Freud got it wrong. Sigmund Freud talked about psychoanalysis, analyzing the root cause of why you are unhappy and what is causing troubling you and so on. Analyze until you are paralyzed. You'll never find a way to solve the problem. But if you can change the way you interpret your circumstances, if you realize that that particular condition is hurting you, you don't have to go to the root cause of how it arises. Change the way you interpret it, and your emotions will not easily be aroused. So there are intervention methods to help. There are so many modern intervention methods. It does not even require a psychologist. Modern intervention methods: hypnotherapy, neuro-linguistic programming, yoga. All these have intervention techniques to help you reframe your mind, rethink what is going on, and by that rethinking, you will then reduce the hurt from the emotional arousal. You may not get rid of it, but you at least reduce its impact. Right? So, trying to analyze until you're paralyzed, you will never really find a way to solve the problem. Because sometimes, if it's a relationship problem, you analyze and analyze down to what the person said. What are you going to do? The person has already said what the person said. Can you ask the person to take it back? You can't. So no point analyzing. It's reinterpreting, changing the way you interpret what is said to you, what it means to you. Someone called me, "Oh, Billy, you're so fat." And then I interpret that, "Oh, he wants to hurt my feeling." And then I get angry. But if I change the way I look at it and say, "Oh, he's such a good friend, he calls me fat because he's concerned for my health," then I should say thank you. Next time somebody calls me fat, I say thank you. Right. Can you do that? Change the way you interpret it. And then it doesn't hurt you. That's what I mean. Simple as that. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a very comprehensive set of therapeutic interventions that can help you to do that. And Bhante mentioned about this basically about the part where cognitive psychotherapy, and that is one part of cognitive behavior therapy. Cognitive behavior therapy basically is a psychosocial intervention method that aims to improve mental health, not eliminate the causes. So the way it does is it focuses on challenging and changing unhelpful thinking pattern, cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions are thinking pattern, thinking traps, the way we interpret something, the thoughts that we consider, the beliefs, the attitudes, assumptions, right, and expectations that leads to behavior. So it aims to do that. At the same time, it also helps to improve our understanding of our own emotions, improving emotion regulation, and also finding ways to cultivate practices that can help us let it go, letting go. Right? So development of personal coping strategies to let go so that it doesn't hurt us. That's the target at solving the current problems. Very important, solving the current problems. The current problem is not the cause of what has started it all. It is what is hurting you. It's actually the symptom, the thing that is hurting you now. Solve that. And that's where hypnotherapy comes in, neuro-linguistic programming comes in, CBT comes in. Psychoanalysis doesn't work. And this is one of the failings of Sigmund Freud. So Bhante mentioned about this cognitive psychotherapy. This is really cognitive psychotherapy. It's a part of CBT. CBT is more comprehensive, more complete. It involves these other things which can prevent future problems arising. But here, basically solving that thing that is hurting you. Now, the important thing is solving problem. And Bhante has this most famous quote I love. Some of you may become aware of it. The purpose of human intelligence is not to discover truth, but to solve problems. Trying to analyze what is hurting you, why it is hurting you, how it is hurting you, all this you're trying to find out the truth behind it. What for? That's not going to solve the problem. Learning how to let it go, learning how not to allow it to hurt you, that is solving the problem. That's what it is. So there are many ways the mind gets disturbed, and this disturbance comes after we interpret something, right? That means when we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, we are aware of it, and then we begin to create stories, the mind running away, and that mind running away, creating stories because of imagination, expectations, and memory. That is mental proliferation. This is thinking traps. Psychologists call this cognitive distortions. And this is from the work of Aaron Beck and various partners. And Aaron Beck is the one responsible for developing the first kind of therapy called cognitive psychotherapy, and which then led to the more comprehensive version, and that is the cognitive behavioral therapy. And I'm not going to go through each one, just to show you quickly. There are 4 pages of these. Mind reading. Jumping to conclusion. We are always trying to imagine what other people are thinking or what they are trying to do to us. So when somebody says to me, "Billy, you're so fat," I start to imagine that he wants to hurt my feeling. That's what it is. Mind reading. I think he wants to hurt my feeling. I'm reading his mind. I'm thinking that's what he's trying to do. Things like that. And fortune telling, trying to predict something, and we can never predict anything. The last one at the bottom, black and white thinking. We always think black or white. It's either you are my friend or you are my enemy. There's nothing in between. So black and white thinking. So this happens a lot between husbands and wives when they quarrel. Very black and white thinking. Either you love me or you hate me. Yeah, nothing in between. And various others, perfectionists, you should be like that and should be expecting things to be ideal, right? And at the bottom, what if? Always wondering, what if this, what if that? But life is anicca, and why keep worrying about what if? What if it's not going to happen? And blaming people or blaming yourself, right? Shame is blaming yourself. And then various others. You can download this list alone if you want to from this link, but this is also found in the whole presentation at the end, so you can also download the whole presentation if you want to. So basically, this is thinking traps. These things lead us into a kind of thinking that is very unhealthy, makes us get angry, regret, fearful, anxious, all kinds of emotional states arising. We're going to learn to tame it and get rid of it, and the only way is to tame our emotions. And emotions, now the important thing about the teachings of the Buddha versus the teachings of psychology. The teachings of psychology is trying to help a sick person to become normal. That means a mentally ill person, a person who has mental conditions, try to bring that person to normal. That's what psychology tries to do. But Buddha actually takes it one step further. Buddha's teachings is actually to take a normal person and train that normal person to sharpen his mind so that he transcends this samsaric kind of thinking, this existential thinking, so that you're able to transcend it and attain a state of nibbana, transcending it beyond normal human existential thinking, right? So the first thing we have to do as Buddhists is to learn how to tame our emotions, and eventually by continuous training and practices we can eliminate it. So let's see what Bhante has to say about that.
One message goes to the amygdala and the emotion is aroused, and the other message goes to the brain where the thinking goes on, and then you begin to change the way. And now they are talking about this, so it's very important to understand that the Buddha has gone even beyond this end. If we see the first verse in the Dhammapada, there in the first verse in the Dhammapada, what you get is Mano Pubbangama Dhamma. which is wrongly translated today. There, mano means the thinking part. I told you there are two things, the thinking part and the emotional part, which is called chitta. Mano pubbangama means the thinking part comes first, before the emotional part. So it is by changing the thinking part, which is what is called the cognitive part, that the affective can be controlled. So it is the thinking part that is able to control. And that is the real secret discovered in the modern world by the cognitive psychologists. They are using that in what is called cognitive psychotherapy. They are using that principle, but still they are not able to fully control the emotions because they don't know about meditation. And but the Buddha used this method, and that is what we are using in this book. If you read this book, here the Buddha is, I am talking about this, that what is called the 7 steps to awakening, Sapta Bojjhanga. The Sapta Bojjhanga is really using that same principle, and that is how the emotions are completely eliminated. And that elimination of the emotion, this is not understood by all the modern meditators who talk about vipassana, bhavana and all that. They are unaware of this. This is why this message that I am talking about is a very important message. That this has to be conveyed to the world. And that is how our friend is now prepared to do these things, that we will be able to somehow convey this message to the world, that the Buddha, how he eliminated all emotions, lobha, dosa and moha, lust, hate and delusion, completely eradicated. He was able to do this because of this Sapta Bojjhanga, based on the principle that you get in the first verse in the Dhammapada.
So Bhante spoke about eliminating emotion, and he said it is the first verse of Dhammapada. It is actually the clue to the solution, but it is unfortunately incorrectly translated. And mano comes before chitta. That is what I have already shown you in the flow chart. Basically, the mano interprets and then the chitta reacts to the interpretation. So by changing the interpretation, the thinking part, the cognitive part, then we can actually control the emotional part. And to stop it completely, this Buddha has described a way to do it, and that is the Satta Bojjhanga. That is the 7 steps to awakening, and when it is cultivated and developed, it will completely eliminate all emotions. When it is able to eliminate all emotions, you are now at the doorstep of Nibbana. Not quite yet, but you need to gain the wisdom of the realities of life, anicca, dukkha, anatta, and be able to understand the paticca-samuppada. When you fully comprehend it, this, then you of course then become the Arahant. And the Buddha has completely eradicated those emotional reactions of lobha, dosa and moha by practicing the Satta Bojjhanga. And therefore he taught us, Buddha taught us, this is the way. And this Satta Bojjhanga is really the real teaching of Vipassana. And this is mentioned in several sutras. I have given sharing on that before. So, and many Vipassana teachers don't talk about Satta Bojjhanga, and that is sad, because the Satta Bojjhanga is really the Buddha's teaching on cultivating Vipassana. And basically, in a nutshell, the first verse of Dhammapada actually gives us the clue. Now, I will show you the translation by other people. One of the most famous and popular translations of Dhammapada is Acharya Buddharakkhita. And again, you can see, now, the Buddha used the word mano up here, but you can see they translate it as what? Mind. Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind route. Right? Well, the rest is fairly straightforward, but this does not help you to understand. Now, I give you another one, very famous one. Thanissaro Bhikkhu. Phenomena, that's even worse, Phenomena are preceded by the heart. This is worse, I don't understand this. Why the heart? Our heart is chitta. Why did mano become the heart? I don't know. Phenomena are preceded, phenomena is the plural. Phenomena are preceded by the heart, ruled by the heart, made of the heart. Right? So that is, I don't understand this. It's very confusing. And another one, famous one, Narada. And mind is the forerunner of all evil states. Mind is the chief. Mind made are they. Again, it doesn't really give you the clue. But Bhante's translation gives you the real clue to that meaning. And that is, cognition precedes our experiences, all experiences. It predominates and creates them, create our reality, our experiences. So in other words, we have to use our thinking mind, the cognition, not just mind as a whole. And you have Thanissaro Bhikkhu translating that to be the heart. I guess the mind is in the heart. That's what he thinks. The heart is nothing but a pump. That's all it is. The heart is not the mind. It's just a pump. That's all it is. The Heart Sutra. I have no comment on other disciplines. So the amygdala is the emotional command center responsible for all these emotional states. This is corresponding to the chitta that was described. The prefrontal cortex is the cognitive command center responsible for our conscious rational thinking, and this corresponds to the mano. And basically, Bhante pointed out, everybody didn't know about meditation. It's the Buddha who taught it. So meditation is stilling the emotions, bringing the emotion to a stillness, stopping the emotion, and then sharpening the cognition so that you are able to see realities. Right? And emotion is the chitta, sharpening the cognition is the mano. But unfortunately, if people were to translate both chitta and mano to be mind, then it doesn't make sense. Stilling the mind, sharpening the mind, that doesn't make sense, I'm not going to talk about the 7 steps to awakening, Satta Bojjhanga, but this is really found in this level 3 book where many copies are at the back. So I suggest you read it yourself. This is not for the faint of heart. So people who have not been meditating for some time, you probably will have some difficulty trying to comprehend this. I suggest you stick to level 1, level 2 book, and only start looking at level 3 when you are able to practice your meditation up to a certain degree. And basically, you can download all this tomorrow. I was in a hurry to leave the house, so I made some last-minute corrections. I did not upload it, so the link is not ready, but I will upload it when I get home tonight. So don't download it tonight. You will get the wrong version. You will get the last week's version. Download it starting tomorrow. I will do it tonight, and then tomorrow morning, you can start downloading it. All my links are tiny.cc, and then this is review 02. So I numbered them. All right. So take note of it. You can easily remember it. tiny.cc/review 02.